Hello, Sir Class. This is my brief. I'm going to be presenting on political typologies, which is part of the extension for Lesson 25, which involved a Pew Research poll. So for the agenda, we're going to get into Republican typologies and Democratic typologies within each of those parties, and then we're going to discuss the long-term political implications of set divisions within each party. So to start off here, we have the faith and flag conservatives, which make up 23% of the Republican Party. They are incredibly conservative on basically all issues. And one of the most important parts of the faith and flag conservative agenda is that they want Christianity to be more prominent in public life. And part of that, in addition to that, they're also very strong Trump supporters. And a lot of them have said that he did in fact win the 2020 election. They're also the oldest typology group in terms of age, and they're also the most politically active typology within the Republican Party. Then we have the committed conservatives, who are very conservative on views, and they kind of favor like a more expansive foreign policy, which is slightly different from some of the other typologies. They voted for him overwhelmingly in 2020 and 2016, but they do have some more reservations than some of the other groups. And they're very politically active, and they're also the most educated, Republican-oriented political typology. Then we have the populist right, which makes up 23%, and they are incredibly restrictive in their views about immigration, abortion, but at the same time they also share kind of like a quasi-democratic view on the economic system, and they're very critical of fairness as well as the profits of banks and large corporations. They are also, again, very strong Trump supporters through 2020 up until the current time. They are also the least likely political typology to have a college degree, so they're among the lowest educated, and they have the highest percentage of them are of rural descent. Then you have the ambivalent right, which is more conservative about the government and the social net, but they're much more progressive on their views about immigration and abortion. They overwhelmingly do not want Trump to remain in politics, and they are also the youngest group. So this is like the next up and coming. A lot of, I think, West Pointers kind of fall into this typology a lot, and they're also much less religious than a lot of the other groups. And then finally, we have distressed sideliners, who are kind of a mix. They lean slightly more liberal economically than a lot of the Republican typologies, but they still kind of share some of the core conservative values about the size of the government and social safety net, and especially government spending. And they're also about as equally likely to be Democrats and Republicans. So we're also going to see them on the next slide, which is, okay, we're back again, my apologies. Now we'll be talking about the Democratic typology. So we'll start with the most progressive and kind of work our way inwards the same way we did with the Republicans. So we have the progressive left, who have just broad scale, very liberal opinions. They're the most likely to identify as the Democratic Socialists within the Democratic Party. So this is where you get Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren to some degree, and which is the two political candidates that they overwhelmingly backed in the most recent election before they ended up voting for Joe Biden. They're also relatively young and very high educated, and a majority of them are also non-white. So it says about 2/3 of them are white, non-Hispanic. Then we have establishment liberals, which make up 23% of the Democratic Party, and they are sort of like the solid, strong base of the Democratic Party. They're somewhat similar to Republicans in where they still have a very upbeat idea about what the nation is, and they favor compromise, and they sort of still have a strong sense of national identity, which they kind of share a lot with the Republican counterparts. They're very politically engaged, similar to the staunch conservatives. They're also one of the more educated political typology groups. They are also incredibly racially and ethnically diverse, and they're kind of reflective as the population as a whole, which is how you end up making them kind of the backbone of the Democratic. You also have the Democratic mainstays, who hold a lot of similar democratic positions about the size of the government, race, and sort of like systemic racism and the social safety net. But they tend to be a little bit less democratic on issues like immigration, the military spending, and crime, which is also like a slightly more conservative viewpoint in many regards. They're the largest Democratic coalition. You can see they make up 28% of the Democratic Party, and they tend to be older, and a lot of them tend to be less college educated than, for example, like the establishment liberals. Um, and once again, they also share a lot of the same racial and ethnic diversity as the establishment liberals. Then you get the outsider left, which is 16% of the Democratic Party, and they're kind of very liberal in issues like climate and race. So this is kind of like the next generation of the Democratic Party, where they're coming through, and a lot of their issues kind of reflect the newer issues of our generation, namely being climate change and kind of this referendum on systemic racism. They vote Democratic, but they also are kind of very dissatisfied with a lot of the political processes they go on, but they also are more inclined to, and kind of with that, being very dissatisfied with the political environment of today, they're more likely to say that other nations are better than the US, and that's kind of sometimes where you get people that point to the Scandinavian countries and sort of the democratic socialist, high taxation, high social safety net kind of environment. They're the youngest typology group within the Democratic Party, so once again, this is like the next generation, and they are also among the least politically active, in large part due to the kind of political ostracization that they feel from both of the parties. Then once again, you get the stressed sideliners, which kind of display a solid mix of both Democratic and Republican ideology, and they make up 13%, but once again, they made up 15% of the Republican Party, so they're kind of a little bit all over the place. Then we go. Here we are, we're back again, so we're going to talk about the political implications and kind of what I like to think about is like the affective polarization that then kind of ensues from the different political typologies. So what this is this is a graph that or a bar chart that kind of represents like how the different political typologies feel about certain aspects of kind of the current political climate. So the first part is it's asked about people that openly criticize Trump, and then it says agree with the Democratic Party and call Democratic officials evil, the same way that it's criticize Joe Biden, agree with Republican Party on some issues, and then call Republican elected officials evil. So what you can kind of see from this is you can see that especially at the very extreme, you get a lot of people that are willing to call the other side evil, and you can definitely see that with faith and flag conservatives, who basically say that 32% of them say that it's not acceptable for elected officials to call other Democratic officials evil, which is kind of slightly alarming considering that like a vast majority, like 68% of them, think that like that is an acceptable and also like a beneficial rhetoric that should be introduced in the political sphere. So I think this kind of shows, it's also very interesting because the faith and flag conservatives and the populist right, actually much more so than the committed conservatives, which kind of shows one of the divides in the actual political typologies and how they play out in real life, because the populist right is also very interesting because they display a lot of the same characteristics as the faith and flag conservatives in terms of like their overall I guess perspective towards Donald Trump especially, and the Democratic Party, and kind of that kind of creates the large ideological shift. In the meantime, you have the committed conservatives who are considered more conservative than the populist right, but then don't share a lot of the same ideological and rhetorical like ideas and kind of beliefs, which is a little bit strange. And then you also have, once again, you have the ambivalent right, the same way that you kind of have the outsider left, that are kind of like significantly removed from those three main political typologies of the Republican Party. And then you can see that on the Democratic side, they're a little bit more, I'd say they're a little bit more willing to call out rhetoric that they find is unhelpful. So a lot of them are more willing to disagree overall with people who then call the other side evil, which then contributes to the affective polarization. And even then, like, it's still not really great, because even then it's all Republicans / swing Republicans, 52% versus 57% are saying they shouldn't be accepting of them. So it's not like there's a considerable amount more on the Democratic side versus the the Republican side, and this kind of bleeds into the affective polarization stuff that we've talked a lot about, which is kind of the phenomenon alienating the other political party as through like rhetoric and saying like us versus them, and like more willing to kind of demonize the other side. And I think that's like, especially now with like a lot of the stuff that's going on in the current political climate, I think is kind of the most interesting thing to look at from this entire process, because you have like a complete ideological shift, and like that's also due to the conflation between identity and political party that's kind of emerged like very recently, and that's something we also spoke a lot about in class, and how the conflation of your identity with your political party then creates like a massive ideological divide in the country that then kind of feeds into a lot of the affective polarization that you can see from these two different graphs, where almost 50% of the population says that it's acceptable to demonize the other side in official political spheres, which I think is incredibly damning and incredibly dangerous in terms of trying to actually build a cohesive nation that's united around like core philosophies. So, and then, okay, so this is just kind of another continuation of the previous slide that we were talking about, kind of with the affective polarization, and it shows the different political typologies. It's called a feeling thermometer, and it's like how they feel about the different candidates. So this is obviously Biden and Trump, and it shows a very clear divide of the political preferences. But it's also kind of interesting because this kind of gets into like the Duverger's law, like third party stuff, because the outsider left is very close to the stressed sideliners, who are also very close to the ambivalent right on their perspective of Biden, which I think is very interesting. And then you also get how the ambivalent right is also very far away from like the populist right, committed conservatives, faith and flag conservatives perspective of Trump, and they're a lot closer to the outsider left, and especially the stressed sideliners specifically. And this kind of gets into like a very interesting thing, because this kind of is kind of how Duverger's law I think kind of came about, which is you have this like very large group of people, right? Because you have the stressed sideliners and the outsider left making up like 30% of the Democratic Party, and then you have stressed sideliners and the ambivalent right making also about 30% of the Republican Party, which means that like if you actually carved out a legitimate third party, they would poll about 30% of the vote, which is like very substantial, because then you would have likely like 30% of the vote going Republican, 30% going Democrat, 30% going to this other side party. But then because of Duverger's law and the need for smaller social movements and smaller political agendas to align themselves under much larger umbrellas in order to gain that mainstream support, then you end up with the outsider left kind of being shoehorned into the large Democratic agenda, the same way that the ambivalent right kind of gets shoehorned into the Republican agenda, even though from looking at the feeling thermometer, the ambivalent right is closer to almost closer to the establishment or like the progressive left compared to their actual connection with the faith and flag conservatives, who are obviously like incredibly pro-Trump and think that he like overwhelmingly won the election. So this is just kind of one of the interesting things that I saw from the affective polarization, because you used to have like all sorts of different parties, and then it became very clear that there was a large Democratic Republican and Federalist, or Whig and Democrat, kind of whatever the political time was and how that split the parties. But now I think as people are becoming more and more alienated from these kind of progressively more extreme policy agendas that are being adopted by these parties, and especially how, at least in the public eye and especially in the media, because of the way that the media tries to construe and sell popular, interesting, like attention-grabbing narratives with the competition in the media, that you get the more extreme voices within both of the parties become the large leading public voices of those parties. And I think that becomes very alienating, especially to the up-and-coming generation, who kind of sees, at least from kind of what I talk to my friends about back home, is kind of sees like a lack of trust and a lack of faith in the actual establishment themselves, which then leads to this kind of centralized group. It's like the moderates or the centrists, or kind of what used to be I think it was called like Rockefeller Republicans, because they were very economically conservative but more socially liberal, which kind of mirrors an outsider left or an ambivalent right kind of perspective. And I think if kind of the affective polarization continues to go, I think that it would be very interesting to see if the outsider left and the ambivalent right, along with the stressed sideliners, kind of end up consistently putting out candidates that are kind of a quasi-mix and actually finding an actual coalition that is a direct challenge to Duverger's law, because there are enough people that become alienated with the political process that they actually form a main party within kind of the centrist political perspective, and instead of pushing to the outsides, you actually have people from the outsides moving inward to the more moderate perspectives to try and align themselves under what could be a much stronger, much more like established political platform kind of in the middle. So that was it for my brief. I just kind of wanted to talk about the political typologies and effective polarization and kind of how that impacts elections and the possibility of kind of the political climate moving forward. Sir, this concludes my brief. Thank you.